I never told her I owned the house. Not the one we were living in, not the 3 rentals across town, not the duplex my late wife Roberta and I bought back in 1987 for $42,000 and held on to through every recession that tried to take it from us. I never told her any of that. As far as my new wife knew, I was just a retired maintenance supervisor living off a modest pension, getting by comfortable enough, nothing to write home about. Looking back, I think that's what saved me. I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I'm not a dishonest man. I spent 31 years working for the county school district. I coached Little League for 12 years. I was a deacon at my church for 9. Roberta used to say I couldn't tell a convincing lie to save my life, and she was right. But what I did, keeping my financial situation to myself, that wasn't a lie so much as it was caution, and I didn't even plan it at first. It just happened, and then when things started going sideways, I understood exactly why God had kept my mouth shut. I was 63 when I met her. It was at one of those community cookouts the neighborhood association puts on every summer in Decatur. Georgia heat, paper plates, somebody's uncle burning chicken on a grill he clearly didn't know how to operate. I wasn't even planning to stay long. My daughter had dropped me off and made me promise I'd actually talk to people instead of standing by the dessert table all evening, which is my natural habitat at social events. Her name was Simone. No, wait, I need to correct myself right there. The woman I married, I'll call her my wife through this story. That's how I'll refer to her. You'll understand why in a moment. She was standing near the lemonade talking to a woman from my church laughing at something, and I thought she had a warm smile. She was probably around 54, 55. She had this easy confidence about her that I found attractive. We talked for almost 2 hours that evening. She was from Alabama originally, had moved to the Atlanta area about 3 years prior. She told me she worked in medical billing. She had a son 20 years old, she said, who was figuring things out. I didn't read too much into that phrase at the time. We dated for 8 months. They were good months, mostly. She was attentive. She cooked well. She came to church with me several times. My daughter, I have one daughter, my baby, 34 years old, sharp as a tack. My daughter met her twice during those 8 months and was polite but quiet afterward in a way that I recognized. My daughter gets quiet when she has something to say, but doesn't think you're ready to hear it. I should have asked. I didn't push. What I did tell my wife during our courtship was that I was retired, that I had a pension, that I owned my home. That last part I volunteered because it came up naturally. She asked once if I rented and I said no, but I never elaborated. When she asked what my house was worth, I said something vague about the market being funny these days. When she asked about savings, I said I had what I needed. She seemed satisfied with that. The truth was I had considerably more than what I needed. After Roberta passed, ovarian cancer, 6 years ago now, and there's not a day that goes by. After she passed, I did a full accounting of everything we'd built together. The house we lived in, paid off in 2009, 3 rental properties, 2 in DeKalb County and 1 out in Covington, the duplex, some investments my brother-in-law had helped me get into in the 90s that had done quietly well. I wasn't a wealthy man by any stretch of what wealthy means in this country, but I was more than comfortable. I was secure. Roberta and I had been careful people our whole lives. I didn't tell my wife any of that, partly because I'd been burned before. Not in a dramatic way, just small things. People finding out you have property and suddenly needing a favor, a loan, a place for their cousin to stay. Partly because my daughter had sat me down early in the relationship and said, "Daddy, just go slow, please." And partly because something in me, some quiet voice I'd learned over 6 decades to pay attention to, said, "Wait, just wait and see who she is first." We got married on a Saturday in April. Small ceremony, just family and close friends, about 40 people total. My daughter stood beside me. She hugged my wife afterward and wished her well, and I saw something in her eyes that I told myself was just the emotion of the day. The following Monday, 48 hours after we said our vows, I want you to understand. 48 hours. My wife sat down across from me at the kitchen table while I was drinking my morning coffee and said she needed to talk about some things. I put my cup down. She started with the house. "Not this house," she said, meaning the house we were sitting in, the house I owned outright, the house Roberta and I had raised our daughter in. Not this house, but she felt like we needed something that was ours together. A fresh start. She'd been looking at some places over in Stonecrest, she said. Nice neighborhood. Good schools, she added, which puzzled me since neither of us had young children. I asked her what was wrong with where we were. She said it was a lovely home, but it had a lot of history. She said it softly, carefully, the way people say things they've rehearsed. She said she sometimes felt like she was living in someone else's life. I said I understood that, and I did, partially. Grief leaves its furniture in a room, but I also knew that this was my home. That Roberta and I had planted the oak tree in the backyard. That my daughter had measured her height in pencil on the doorframe of the laundry room every year from age 5 to 16. The pencil marks were still there. I'd never paint over them. I told her we could talk about it. I kept my voice even. She moved on to the second thing. Her son, she said, needed a place to stay. He'd been with a roommate situation that had fallen through. She framed it as temporary. 2, maybe 3 months, just until he got stable. She said he was a good kid, just going through a transition. I asked how old he was. She said 22. I said I thought he was 20. She said she might have said 20 before, but he was 22. I stayed quiet for a moment. I'm a man who has learned that silence is a useful tool. I said, we didn't talk about this before the wedding. She said she didn't think it would become an issue so soon. I said, where would he sleep? She said, the guest room, of course. It's just sitting there, the guest room, where my sister stays when she visits from Memphis, where my grand sleeps when my daughter brings him over. That guest room. I nodded and said I'd think about it. She moved on to the third thing, and this is where I felt something in my chest go very still. She said she had some debt. Not a lot, she said, just some accumulated things, credit cards mostly, and a personal loan she'd taken out a couple years back. She was working on it, she said, but it had gotten a little ahead of her. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a number. It was not a small number, and then she said, I just feel like if we're really partners, we should handle things together. I looked at that piece of paper. I looked at my coffee cup. I looked out the window at the oak tree in the backyard, the one Roberta and I planted as a sapling the year we moved in. I said, let me think about all of this. I need a few days. She reached across and put her hand on mine and smiled and said, of course, sweetheart, there's no rush. There was a rush. I could feel it. That evening, I called my daughter. I didn't tell her everything immediately. I just asked her to come over for dinner later that week. She said, Daddy, what's wrong? I said, nothing's wrong. I just want to see you. She said, Daddy, and I said, Thursday, baby. I'll make that chicken you like. She came over Wednesday. She sat in my kitchen and listened while I told her everything, all 3 items from that Monday morning conversation, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, how soon after the wedding? I said, Monday morning. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and said, has she seen any of your paperwork, your property tax statements, anything? I said, no. I kept all of that in my filing cabinet in the office, and she hadn't been in there. My daughter nodded slowly. She said, okay. Then she said, Daddy, do you know what I think you should do? I said, tell me. She said, nothing yet. Just watch. I've always trusted my daughter's judgment. She gets it from her mother. The following week, my wife brought up the house in Stonecrest again. She'd scheduled a showing, she said, for that Saturday, with a realtor, without asking me. She said it casually, the way you mentioned you've already started dinner, so you'll be eating at 6. I said, I didn't agree to look at houses. She said, it's just looking, honey. What's the harm? I said, the harm is we didn't discuss it. She got quiet and her face changed, just for a second, and I saw something that wasn't the warm smile from the cookout. Then it came back, the smile, and she said she just wanted us to build something together. She said she hoped I wasn't one of those men who kept their wives locked out of financial decisions. I let that sit in the air between us. I said, I'm not that kind of man. But I'm also not a man who makes $60,000 decisions in a weekend. She said, 60,000? Honey, we'd be looking at more than that for a down payment on something in Stonecrest. And there it was. Because I never said anything about a down payment. I never mentioned numbers at all. I'd told her I owned my home and had a pension. That's it. So she got from that to assuming we could comfortably put down a significant sum on a second property in a week and a half of marriage. That told me more than anything else she'd said. I called my attorney the next morning. I've had the same attorney for 22 years, a man my father-in-law introduced me to back when Roberta and I were buying our first rental. I trust him the way I trust my daughter and my mechanic, completely and without question. I told him the situation. He listened without interrupting, which is why I pay him what I pay him. He said, "You haven't commingled anything yet?" I said, "No." He said, "Good. Keep it that way. Don't add her to any accounts. Don't show her any documents. And don't make any joint purchases." I said, "She's my wife." He said, "I understand that. And if she's who you hope she is, none of this will matter and you can sort it all out with time. But right now you don't know which situation you're in." I sat with that. I still wanted to be wrong. I want to be honest about that. I was 63 years old and I had been lonely for 6 years, and I had wanted this to be real. I had sat in this house by myself through too many quiet Sundays, and I had wanted company that meant something. I had prayed for it, and when this woman sat across from me at that cookout with that warm smile, I had let myself believe it was an answer. But the voice that had told me to wait, to not disclose, to be careful, that voice was getting louder. Her son moved in 11 days after the wedding. I hadn't agreed to it exactly. What happened was I came home one evening and there were bags in the hallway and he was standing in my kitchen eating cereal out of a bowl I'd had since 1994. He was a large young man, early 20s, and he barely looked up when I came in. My wife came out of the bedroom and explained in a bright voice that things with the roommate had really fallen apart. She'd meant to call me, but the day had gotten away from her. She looked at me with an expression that was asking me not to make this into something. I looked at the young man. He looked at me and said, "Hey." I said, "Hello, welcome." And then I went to my office and I sat in the chair behind my desk and I thought about what my daughter had said. Just watch. Over the next 3 weeks I watched. I watched my wife go through the mail that came to the house, including pieces addressed only to me. When I mentioned it, she said she was just trying to be organized. I watched her mention the Stonecrest house 3 more times. Each time the number for what we'd need was larger than the time before. I watched her son come and go at hours that suggested he wasn't working, and when I gently asked my wife about it, she said he was in between opportunities. I watched her pick up my phone once when she thought I was in the shower. I wasn't. I was standing in the hallway. She didn't know I saw her. I watched her friend come over one afternoon while I was supposed to be at my Thursday card game. I came home early because Herschel's knee was acting up and we'd cut it short. I heard them talking in the living room. The friend was asking if she'd found out yet. My wife said she was working on it, that I was careful, but nobody was that careful. It would surface eventually. I stood in my own hallway and listened to that. I didn't go in. I went quietly back to the garage and waited 20 minutes and then came in through the front door loudly, calling out that I was home. By the time I got to the living room, the friend was her purse and saying she had to run. That night, after my wife fell asleep, I sat in my office and I made a list. Not an angry list, a clear-eyed list. Everything I had observed, everything that didn't add up, dates, amounts she'd mentioned, things that contradicted other things she'd said. I've always been a methodical man. It's what made me good at my job for 31 years. Then I called my daughter and told her what I'd heard in the hallway. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daddy, we need to talk to your attorney." We met with him the following Tuesday. My daughter sat beside me across the desk from him, and she was the most like her mother in that moment. Calm, precise, no wasted words. My attorney listened and then walked us through my options. He talked about what was protected, what wasn't, what could get complicated if it dragged on. He was honest with me that the longer it went, the messier certain things could become, even with precautions. I asked him what he would do. He said he couldn't tell me that, but he said whatever I decided, I should decide soon. I drove home that evening and I sat in the backyard, in the chair I keep near the oak tree. It was one of those Georgia evenings in early June, where the air finally lets go of the heat just a little, and the fireflies start coming up from the grass. Roberta loved that time of evening. She'd bring out sweet tea and we'd sit out there and not even have to say much. I stayed out there for a long time. When I went inside, my wife was in the kitchen on her phone. She looked up and smiled and asked where I'd been. I said I was in the backyard thinking. She said, "About what?" I said, "About us, about where things are headed." She put her phone down and her expression shifted into something attentive and a little careful. She said, "Me too." She said she'd been thinking we really needed to make some decisions together about the house, about getting her name added to things so she felt like a real partner in this marriage. I said, "I hear you." She said, I just don't feel like I know where we stand. Financially, I feel like there are things you're not telling me. I said, "You're right." She blinked. She wasn't expecting that. I said, "There are things I haven't told you. I've been waiting to understand what kind of marriage this was going to be before I shared certain information. I think I have a better picture now." She said, "What do you mean? What kind of marriage?" I said, "I own this house. I own it outright, no mortgage. I also own 3 rental properties and a duplex. I have investment. I am not a wealthy man, but I am financially secure in a way I didn't share with you. And I want to be honest with you about why I didn't." She was very still. I said I didn't share it because I wasn't sure whether you were interested in me or in what I had. And over the past several weeks, I've gotten my answer. She started to say something. I held up my hand gently. I said, "I watched you go through my mail. I heard you tell your friend you were working on finding out about my finances. I know about the conversation. I was in the hallway." The color in her face changed. I said, "I'm not angry. I want to be clear about that. I'm not yelling. I'm just telling you what I know. And I'm telling you that I've spoken with my attorney. And I'm asking you now, plainly, is there any version of this where you actually want to be married to me? The man, not the property?" She didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I got my second answer. What happened after that was painful in the way that necessary things often are. There were tears, hers, and honestly some of mine too, because I had allowed myself to hope, and there's always grief in giving that up. There were conversations. There was an attorney involved on her side eventually. Her son moved out within the week, and I will say this for him. He left without incident and looked genuinely embarrassed, which made me think he was probably better than the situation he'd been put in. It took about 2 months to fully untangle. My attorney was worth every dollar. Because we'd never commingled assets or made joint purchases, the separation was cleaner than it might have been. My daughter came over the weekend after everything was finalized. She brought my grandson. We sat in the backyard by the oak tree, and he ran around in the grass catching fireflies in his hands and then opening his palms to let them go every time, and then laughing when they lit up and floated away. My daughter sat next to me and didn't say "I told you so," because she's not that kind of person, because she's her mother's child. She just said, "You okay, Daddy?" I said I was getting there. She put her head on my shoulder for a minute, the way she used to do when she was small and tired, and we watched her boy chase the light. I have thought a lot about what it means to be a careful man. Roberta used to tease me about it. I check locks twice for bed. I keep records of everything. I read the fine print. She said I made life feel very safe. I think she meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. Being careful didn't keep me from being fooled, but it kept the fooling from becoming a catastrophe. There's a difference, and I'm grateful for it. I'm 64 now. I still live in this house, the one with the pencil marks on the laundry room door frame. I still sit in the backyard on June evenings. I'm not closed off. I don't want to be one of those men who lets one bad season turn him cold for the rest of his life. Roberta wouldn't have wanted that for me. But I listen to the quiet voice now. I don't argue with it anymore. It has never once steered me wrong, and I've been a fool every time I talked myself out of it. If you're out there starting over at an age when starting over feels both necessary and terrifying, I want you to hear this. Take your time. Let people show you who they are. Protect what you and your person built together. That's not selfishness. That's stewardship. And trust the voice inside you that says, "Wait." It's usually the wisest one in the room.